There is, of course, no such thing as the future. Instead, there is a near infinity of potential futures. The road ahead of us stretches in abundant directions. We get to choose the route. Now, some of these futures will be better than others. Some will be worse. Some will be more just. Some will be more dishonorable. Some will be safer. Some will be more dangerous. But one thing that all of these timelines share is that they will be unlike the present. Now, I'm not the first to say this, of course. The idea that we're on the brink of some precipitous change is almost a Silicon Valley cliche. Usually it's told in support of some techno-utopian story, some revolutionary network or platform or app just around the corner that's going to change the course of humanity. Just occasionally that does happen. But I think this is a more structural and a deeper change that I'm trying to talk about here. We're reaching the end of a long and relatively stable trajectory for several reasons, really, but I think just three that truly matter. One socioeconomic, one technological, and one ecological. The socioeconomic factor first. The promise of the industrial growth age was that the tide would rise for everyone. We'd have this world of positive sum benefit, where, sure, some people would benefit more than others, but generally the curve would only ever go up. Suffice to say, average people no longer think that that is happening. Inequality has become baked into our modern world as a design feature, and it's now growing beyond any kind of tolerable levels. Thomas Piketty, the economist who, as I'm sure you know, wrote Capital, explains that the power of wealth is now approaching levels we haven't seen since World War I. Wealth is growing faster than economic output. In other words, capital begets capital, and so we're returning to an era of inherited wealth, and almost a recurrence of the era of the robber barons, where the 1% get all the cream, and the wealth of the bottom half withers away. For all the technology industry's bold talk of how we're going to democratize and disrupt stagnant industry, I actually see the web as a machine for creating monopolies. Metcalfe's law, one of the most fundamental rules of system behavior, of network dynamics, argues that the value of a network is proportional to the square of the number of users that it has. So of course, this means that users attract users, or if you have a two-sided marketplace, users attract providers, who in turn attract users, and the cycle continues. If we look at search or social media or photo sharing, there's really only one dominant provider. If we look at mobile operating systems, there are perhaps two. Domestic AIs, two, maybe three, depending on how you count them. And of course, these dominant companies, these enormously powerful companies, are run with fewer staff than any of their predecessors. And these folks are in demand, they're well compensated, and of course that just furthers the concentration of wealth. I think there's no surprise now that 2010's Silicon Valley is attracting similar ire to the banking industry of the 1980s. But it's really the political consequence of this inequality that's most troubling. Citizens are starting to turn away from democracy, feeling that the system is leaving them behind. Support for democracy is waning sharply, alarmingly so among young people. I suppose if you see no future, then why would you support the status quo? So instead, there's a temptation to turn to extremism, to autocracy, to demagoguery, pretty much the political theme of the last few years. Now, that economic shift of inequality, that might be manageable. We might be able to reverse that, but I think this political shift could be a one-way valve. It's notoriously hard to reverse dictatorship or autocracy without violent intervention. So if this trend continues, and I think we're definitely heading toward that cliff edge, we could face significant destabilization of the world in the very near future. The second shift is entirely technological. Again, perhaps it's not a breakthrough revelation to say that AI has the potential to uproot a lot of society. But it doesn't have to go in quite the way that we've been told. We've heard so much about the intelligence explosion how we're on the brink of, in the next couple of decades perhaps, superintelligence, the singularity, the end of work, even the end of the human. There's a lot of hyperbole and hockey stick projections that go with that. But of course, we don't even know if superintelligence will ever happen, but it doesn't really, for me, matter. We don't need superintelligence for AI to be highly disruptive to our world. The idea of automation, of course, is nothing new either. Mireia Solis of the Brookings Institute says that automation has been the primary cause of 85% of job losses in the US over the course of history. But the automation, I suppose, that we're on the brink of is different in that it's going to be cognitive automation rather than just physical automation. And so it can affect different types of job, not just those we'd consider at the lower end of the skill tiers. It's going to affect the mid-tier information processing roles and even the high expertise roles as well. Any job can be broken down into constituent parts, and many of those parts will be susceptible to cognitive automation. And in turn, this then can have economic effects. If we think of our economies as made up of labor and capital, then, of course, if labor costs start to shrink as we start to automate people, and there's nothing to suggest that isn't going to continue happening, the system is really designed for that incentive, then as labor shrinks, the influence of capital further sinks its claws into our economy. So AI is very likely to end up as a further vector for the inequality that I talked about. And then this is, of course, to say nothing of posthumanism, the idea that we can augment the individual beyond human capabilities, creating some kind of two-tier of humanity. Or to say nothing of computer vision, the machine-readable world that creates a hypermap of our every movement, our every whisper. Or synthetic speech and video that leads to evidence collapse, that leads to us questioning the fundamental truths of our world. And of course, if we do get to some kind of superintelligence, all bets are off. Nick Bostrom, the philosopher at Cambridge, says that machine intelligence would be the last invention humanity ever has to make. And it will confer gargantuan power to anyone who creates it. If you own the means of production, that's enormously potent if you can produce pretty much anything. It's going to break pretty much any economic model that we choose to throw at it, particularly capitalism. And it could happen. New York Times ran a poll of AI researchers, and they came up with a rough estimate of perhaps 50 years before an artificial intelligence of some description will be able to write a New York Times bestseller. And of course, then within that 50 years, that does pose these foundational questions. What would be the role for the human in that situation? Would we be seen as masters, as equals, or as pests? Now, the previous two factors are probable rather than certain. There could be a way that inequality recedes, or democracy regains a grip on the developed world, or that AI fails to live up to these lofty expectations. But there is one transformative factor that is now inevitable. It stretches across every possible future, and that, of course, is climate change. Thanks to the lag between emissions and impact, if you like, the awful physics of our immense atmosphere, it's certain that things are going to get worse for decades before they get better. The punishment's in the post. The only question now is how bad things will get. Now, for years, climate scientists have had to rather tiptoe around the topic. They've been afraid of being labeled alarmists. We're now, at last, starting to realize that alarmism is fully justified. David Wallace Wells's book, The Uninhabitable Earth, opens with a punch to the gut. It is worse, he says, much worse than you think. Because climate will exacerbate every injustice in the world. Racism, oppression, poverty, war. Climate will become the Damoclean backdrop accelerating all of these injustices and essentially forming this dark dystopian backdrop for all future generations. Now, the trajectory, just how bad things will get, really will be decided within the next couple of decades. We will at least get to choose our own misadventure. If we compare with global pre-industrial temperatures, maybe we'll end up with 1.5 degrees of warming. This is a figure that's well known, of course. This is the intended limit of the Paris Agreement. But even if we end up with just 1.5 degrees, that's 50% of the world's population would be facing severe heat wave every 20 years, 130 million people exposed to severe drought, and an 8% drop in global GDP per capita. And this 1.5 degree target, unfortunately, is almost certainly lost. We're at around 1.1 already. The US, as we know, has withdrawn from Paris. Brazil has threatened to follow suit. And everyone who's still in is falling far short of the pledges that they've made. So maybe we'll end up somewhere close to 3 degrees. At 3 degrees of warming, we can expect extended droughts and crop failures and significant geopolitical breakdown. This idea of this eternal growth age simply can't be sustained, I suppose, in a 3 degree world. And so the implication then is clear. In place of this positive sum system, we'll revert to zero sum systems, isolation, nationalism, and resource wars. If you win, I lose. The UN World Meteorological Organization says 3 degrees is probably roughly where we'll end up if countries immediately today start sticking to their Paris pledges. A senior anonymous member of the IPCC Council sees 3 degrees as a likely minimum for where we end up. If we were as unfortunate as to get to a 5 degree future, it's almost unimaginable. We'd be facing temperatures last seen on the planet 55 million years ago. Major global cities, Osaka, Shanghai, Jakarta, Miami, would be virtually wiped out. Much of the Middle East and South Asia would become uninhabitable. The Hajj pilgrimage, for example, would become a physical impossibility. Large areas of mainland Europe would be turned to desert. Instead, Canada and Siberia and Antarctica would become among the planet's last fertile lands. Put simply, if we get to 5 degrees of warming, we are the asteroid. Society will devolve into a naked fight for survival. Now, the 5 degree target or the 5 degree future is unlikely, but possible. There are still some who give it sort of estimates around the 10% likelihood. But it's certain that without urgent reduction in emissions, 5 degrees is where we're headed if we fail to take any kind of action. Now, through the great acceleration that we've experienced since World War II, most of the world has had these huge increases in standards of living, almost entirely predicated upon burning fossil fuels. This addictive lifestyle is going to be hard to give up. But it doesn't really matter whether you think we ought to give it up or not. It cannot and will not last. We've spent decades living by the growth mentality. We now face the very real prospect of dying by it. So whatever the future's like, it cannot be like today. We're nearing the end of what we have considered business as usual, this growth era that's ruled our world for perhaps 350 years. Unfortunately, designers have been complicit in this degradation. Victor Papanek, who was mentioned earlier today, savaged designers for their contributions to environmental degradation. The quote again that you've already seen, there are professions more harmful than industrial design, says Papanek, but only a very few of them. Now, it's tempting to think that that doesn't apply to technologists. We deal in the digital world in abstractions of pixels and information rather than atoms and landfill and pollution. But I don't think that distinction holds. We don't get to wriggle off the hook of responsibility. Just ask the software engineer who cheated Volkswagen's emissions tests, or the airline team using dark patterns to sell unnecessary flights. And indeed, I now think that the very idea of user-centered design and user-centricity is part of the problem. It's trained us to focus with laser-like precision on the end user, but we've failed to interrogate who that user actually is. With some exceptions for different domains, of course, but typically in tech, that user is a fairly privileged, rich individual, often trying to achieve consumerist goals, buying more, consuming more, emitting more, everything more, more, more. And we've instilled in this individual a thirst for exemplary user experiences, which creates aggressive upgrade cycles, people buying new handsets every couple of years, IoT devices with irreplaceable batteries, obsolescence built in as a design principle. And this precision in our focus on the user has blinded us. It's made us only care about the consumer. It's caused us, therefore, to overlook the harm that we potentially do to a broader set of stakeholders, people from vulnerable or underrepresented groups, or the poor, or even intangible yet terrifically important social constructs like neighborhoods, democracies, workers, the earth itself. I think user experience potentially as an idea, as a concept, is a dream come true for these individuals, these consumers, but it could be a potential nightmare for society. And the latest trends in our industry seem intent on actually steering us into this crash. When I look at the design field right now, the main theme I see is effectiveness. Design ops, design systems, things like this are all about making the modern team more scalable, more efficient, more impactful. But they don't question the larger purpose of design. They don't challenge the path that we're on. So the danger is that this trend for modular and high-performing effective design teams really just makes us acquiescent and compliant to the same business as usual as dragging us into inequality and climate catastrophe. But designers aren't the only people who are focusing on the wrong things, focusing on minutiae. Even the tech ethics movement, which I'm somewhat part of. And you'd think they'd be focusing really on the biggest issues in tech, and granted, sometimes they are. But they also sometimes get lost on these trivial surface-level issues. This was critiqued brilliantly by Oz Keyes, Jevon Hudson, and Meredith Durbin, their three scholars at the University of Washington. And they proposed a paper for CHI. I'm sure many of you know CHI. If you don't, it's the world's biggest, I think, academic HCI conference. So they proposed this CHI paper in which they describe a hypothetical algorithm that decides which senior citizens are chosen, are selected to be mulched into high-nutrient slurry and then fed to the living. Now, the authors analyzed this deeply problematic algorithm and suggested some changes, ways that you could reduce the inherent biases within that system, just as the literature on algorithmic ethics says we should. And just with these few simple ethical tweaks, the authors now were happy to announce that elderly people would now be selected for processing into high-nutrient slurry and fed to the living in a far more fair, accountable, and transparent manner. I worry that we're squandering our global capabilities and our global responsibilities on minutiae, on trivia, on stoking the engines of growth more efficiently, right as the ship is going down. So where would our time actually be well spent? What can we do to tackle the changes ahead of us at the proper level? A lot of the world, perhaps most of the world, will need to be re-engineered, rethought, refactored in the coming years and decades to cope with these changes. Our systems and our institutions and our imaginations are not ready for what's coming next. So this has to be our focus, not the details of apps and buttons and productivity and design systems. Speaking broadly, I think I see two main tasks ahead of us. The first is we need to convince people that change is necessary. We need to help them recognize we have to let go of this life. In the face of change and of difficulty and friction, it's natural that people will regress to comfort, to their familiar old trajectories. Again, you could say that's something we've seen in Western politics. The UK, at the moment, is gripped by nostalgia. Now, as a designer and a futurist, I see this as my failing, as our community's failings. We haven't painted a compelling vision of how things really could be. Now, I think in an abstract and existential way, a lot of people have this nagging feeling that something has to change. But thinking about the personal lived experience, those complex transitions that lie ahead of us, the personal and collective sacrifice that we may have to make, that's extraordinarily difficult. that abyss really does stare back. But we have to help people confront the magnitude of the change required and help bring those thoughts from the back of the mind to the front. But then we also have to help people cope with the emotional and psychological toll that can take. The depth of change ahead of us, I think, means we need nothing less than mourning. We have to grieve for this familiar way of life. We have to go through those familiar steps: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, before we get to acceptance. So maybe that's our role, is to help people through that process. I think the best way to achieve that is not necessarily to focus on the evils of this world, but instead to excite people by showing what life could be like. And I think designers have a superpower here. I think a talent that equips designers to really attack these enormous challenges in the world is that we make futures visible. Society, I think, struggles to think intelligently about the future because we ask them to do it really as a thought experiment, to imagine what might happen and then make decisions based on that hallucination. But design can make it real. It can paint a picture of what various futures might actually look and feel and sound like. And we do that by creating products, of course, hopefully more sustainable and just products. But we can also create speculative objects, objects that aren't grounded by having to be immediately realizable or real, objects that invite discussion and inspire change by prototyping a world yet to come. And so we might see these in the field of speculative design wrapped up in what we'd call a design fiction. Now, sometimes these would be designed objects themselves. This is a prototype charging station by Marcel Schoenaar and Harm van Beek. And it's a great big, it's a 2-meter tall, pretty hefty artifact. And they designed this in response to a brief from 2 energy clients in the Netherlands, asking them to look at public charging infrastructure for electric vehicles in an era of energy scarcity. And the way it works is this. On the right-hand side here, you see you have some cards that give you status within the system that you use to authenticate, and then various dials to control how much energy requesting from the system. You plug in your cable at the bottom, and then the algorithm does the rest. It decides, well, who gets what amount of energy when, based on those competing requests. But the interesting thing about this design, of course, is actually not the charging unit itself, but the status cards, the RFID cards, which allocate you social status as well as status within the energy system. We might have at the top here a card for a doctor. Maybe they get top priority within the system. Underneath, a probation ID, maybe something we give to someone out on bail or a recent offender, which caps their use. And so by creating this unreal speculative artifact, the designers have started us down a path of thinking, or recognizing perhaps the dangers of the IoT and energy scarcity coming together to create increasingly unjust worlds where inequality is actually baked in to the system. Design systems are sometimes, design fictions rather, are sometimes told as part of a larger story, in which case designers can pair with writers and filmmakers, comic strip artists, anyone really who can build a hypothetical world in which our designed object feels at home. This is Frames, directed by Farhad Pakdel and written by Madeline Ashby. And I think it's a remarkable design fiction short film of this unnamed woman pushing back against the seams of total surveillance with mysterious generosity. Works like this, and like the charging station, they make potential futures visible. They make them feel real. Something that was hidden now comes into plain sight. And why I think this is so powerful and so important for design is this makes it easier for people to understand what might happen next. We could argue that it improves people's temporal literacy to extrapolate and to imagine and to put themselves into alternative timelines. And this is so important because in doing so, people can then have a fairer say about that future. The future comes to the people. It's no longer the domain of people who think about this stuff like us for a living. The public gets to converse and to debate and contest potential futures. They can approve of them, they can reject them. Some of these fictions, some of these futures, of course, will be dystopian. This is mitigation of shock by Superflux. And they prototyped essentially a London flat from the year 2050 that was built to cope with the impacts of climate crisis. You might have seen a recipe on the notice board there for Fox Creole. So it's this kitchen sink dystopia showing desperate attempts for people trying to cultivate food in climate crash London. Now these dystopias, something like this, I think they have some value. I think this is really good work. Dystopias can alert people to risks ahead. They can challenge what seem like harmless decisions today. But I think they're also ultimately quite limited. Dystopias can sometimes motivate change, but they can also paralyze. They can ostracize. They can cause inaction. We can cause us to conclude, well, there's nothing more we can do. And I think that's dangerous fatalism. That will cause people to withdraw from problems rather than looking to fix them. They'll instead see how they can just cope with them. The growing far-right threat of eco-fascism is essentially built in a climate dystopia and predicated upon the idea that it's too late now. And so the only reasonable solution is to close the borders and instill martial law, or essentially to compete for resources with people who are unlike us. So these cautionary tales, I think they can be helpful to break down our comfortable and cozy narratives, but we desperately need, I think, new visions, new stories that depict a better world to come. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about utopias here. I think we have thousands of mostly meaningless utopias. This is one, it's a Microsoft Vision video, and it doesn't say anything to me other than this is a mere extension of business as usual. The only message here is that the status quo will accelerate. Work and productivity and capitalism will be flung onto any available surface. I think instead what we need are meaningful and realistic, albeit imperfect, but compelling visions that make us dream, that help us inspire people, that we want to move actively towards. Visions like solarpunk, for example. Solarpunk is part a literary movement, it's part a protest group, it's part a sort of work of collaborative design fiction. But it's all based on trying to answer the question of what does a sustainable society look like and how might we get there? They focus on this idea of infrastructure as a form of resistance. So essentially building a society that can cope with whatever comes next. A society that's independent but not isolationist, that relies on ingenuity rather than some messianic invention from outside the system. And I think this is, for me, much more compelling than other punk suffixes that we may be familiar with. We've heard of cyberpunk, of course, but it's a deeply nihilistic perspective that's woven through that, and this is an optimistic take. We've heard of steampunk. For me, that's regressive nostalgia, unlike the futurism of solarpunk. So for me, this is a glimpse of the power of positive stories about the future. If a dystopia gives people something to run away from, a better vision of the future gives some hope, some beacon that we can try to run toward. So I think we have to get past this fatalist narrative, this idea that we simply can't do anything now, by relying on hope. That mourning is essential, but only so that we can get people through that mourning, through that loss, and onto hope, onto positive change. And I mentioned then that there are two responsibilities for designers, so this then is the second. I think once we've painted a portrait of what these better visions of the future can be, we need then to help those actually be realized. Because, of course, the transitions are particularly tricky, particularly dangerous. Moving from one form of society to another involves, well, some friction, at least, let's put it mildly. Now, that's a process that can, to an extent, be anticipated, can be mitigated. There's a whole field called transition design that starts to look into these in some detail that probably requires a whole other talk. But one key question keeps cropping up when we talk about large-scale system change? Should the focus be on individual change, individual action, or should we try to tackle the system itself? This is a sort of a holy war, isn't it, when we start talking about systems thinking or complex systems like ethics or climate. And it's also politicized. The right tends to believe in the sovereignty of the individual to make choices. The left tends to believe that systems rather overwhelm individual choices. So there's a political schism there as well. But I think it is clear that on their own, it's not really going to work. Individual change doesn't really do much alone. In atomized society, it sort of privatizes the issue. When it comes to inequality or climate change, it's very easy to feel guilt about how much we earn or how much we fly. I should do this, I shouldn't do that. So maybe that suggests instead we should try to aim at the system. But where do we start? These things are impenetrable. They're really beyond individual reach. And so sometimes focusing on system change actually excuses irresponsible personal behavior. Taking that first-class long-haul flight, saying, well, I know it's wrong, but it really doesn't make any difference. What we've got to do is change the overall system. But surely, the only meaningful response is to do both. When you see the iceberg dead ahead, you throw every engine into reverse. And in truth, this is a false dichotomy. These things both affect each other. The systems that we're interested in, these socio-economic and political systems, they can change. They are permeable, just not by the individual. The key is collective external pressure from citizens and voters and consumers and donors. So we need to build that kind of pressure, that kind of support. Now that sounds still extremely daunting, but there is some hope, some positive evidence that actually it might be a little bit easier than we think. For example, friends and family play a huge role in shaping individual beliefs around climate change. These are the findings of a very recent climate study, just a couple of months old. And the authors of this study found that differences in beliefs and attitudes around climate change were a lot smaller if people had friends and family who cared about the issue. Now, they called that high social consensus. That's the green bar you see on the right. So there were 4 key questions they asked. Well, there were more, but these were the 4 kind of largest. Essentially, do you agree with the statement that global warming is happening? And they found a huge increase, particularly among self-described conservatives in the US who've historically been resistant to climate change narratives. A huge increase in agreement with this statement if the individual has family and friends who talk and care about climate. And they found this effect across the most important questions to do with climate, that it's caused by humans, that we should worry about the topic, and that we should regulate carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. Now, for me, I think these are remarkable findings. They're promising findings for people wrestling with these sorts of wicked problems. They suggest that concern and hope can be contagious, that even our most ardent and stringent opponents can be challenged and changed in their views. So for me, this emboldens me to think that we can begin to turn the tide of enormous entrenched systems. We just have to mobilize in the right way. We have to find the right people, activate them, and then ask that they do the same, that they then pass on that message. And it suggests really that instead of that false dichotomy between individual and system change, the picture's rather more like this. Individual change snowballs, it becomes collective change. And collective change then has a real chance of influencing and changing these otherwise impenetrable economic and political systems. So this gives me some renewed confidence that we can make the kind of impact that we need, particularly if we focus here on the seams, on turning individual action into some kind of collective change, and then creating tools to bind together movements for that to happen. And then also trying to create systems whereby collections of individuals and collectives can start to exert that kind of pressure on these systems. Now, if we are going to be successful in that mission, clearly we have to rethink the role of design in this. We have to lift our eyes from the rather limited horizons that we've been operating with. We have to reconsider our priorities and our values. But I think we also have to start developing some intuitive understanding of where we might be contributing to the problem, where our old patterns of thinking might be undoing these sorts of efforts. So if I may, I'll offer some incomplete thoughts on where that may happen. I would say if your work is based on the idea of perpetual growth, if you don't consider the harm that you might be doing with your work, if you focus entirely on shareholder value, if you treat people as means and not ends, if you're promoting individual consumption and productivity rather than social well-being, if you're considering the best case only and not every case, and of course then if your work doesn't make you damn proud, then perhaps you are contributing to the injustices and the cliff edges that we're facing. So for me, a more complete picture of where design goes now is some balancing of priorities. Today's practices are mostly on the left-hand side of this equation. They've been focused on delivery, near-term output, supportive of business as usual, sort of compliant with these ideologies and these ideals. But I think a new role for design is different. It's speculative, not just convergent. It's critical, not just ideologically compliant. It focuses on the well-being of society and the planet, not just that of the user. Now, we'll still do the things on the left-hand side, of course. Designers will always help to give birth to good technologies, hopefully more sustainable and fair ones. We don't stop that work, but I think we have to find ways to balance it with these new modes of design, speculative and critical approaches, long-term futures thinking. Because our futures are full of maybes and perhapses. By necessity, they sort of invite this kind of speculative approach. Now, to do that, designers will need some kind of new skills. We'll have to learn from and partner with the people already in this space. We'll probably have to get more adept in what we might call the narrative arts of writing and storytelling and filmmaking. We should absolutely spend time cozying up to and learning from our friends in futures thinking and strategic foresight. We should increase our political and our ethical literacy. And of course, we're going to need to dive ever deeper into the complex world of systems thinking. But ultimately, we'll only be successful if we make design far more deeply, radically inclusive. Too long, we've focused on empathy as our watchword, essentially designing with other people in mind. But we need to replace that with designing with other people. Empathy's become a crutch for designers. It's used as an ethical defense sometimes. Well, I can't have done something wrong. I used empathy. But again, user centricity really means empathy just for users, consumers, quite visible but quite narrow ones. It causes us to overlook other stakeholders. So if we go with this more radically inclusive style of design, it also has a powerful benefit, which is that it redistributes power. It means we don't fall into the trap of thinking we technocrats should solve democratic problems. It can't be the already powerful people like us who get to define the future. Now here, of course, we're getting slightly into political territory, and this is a modern cliche in design to say that it's political, and it always has been. But it's true. Where it's appeared not to be, that's only because it's aligned invisibly with the default politics of that time. And similarly, design is and has always been ethical. Because when you design, you're making a claim about what should be, about how people should live in years to come, how we should interact with products and artifacts and technologies, and therefore, by extension, with each other. Now, this sort of ethically and politically loaded work will upset people, it will scare people, particularly sometimes our corporate peers, the very people that we've tried so hard to impress these last decades. They'll tell us that these speculative and critical forms of design are incompatible with the way they want to do business. And of course they are. That's the whole point. I think this idea of clinging to some neutrality in our work is frankly unsustainable. I think given the present crisis ahead of us, if in doubt, your loyalty has to be to the world and not to your employer. Speaking personally, I don't want a seat at the table. I want to flip that table over. Now, I recognize I say that from a position of privilege. I'm an independent and senior member of the field. I don't answer to anyone. I have the luxury I can make these bold statements when I'm on a stage. Not everyone has these advantages, and I would never criticize someone who doesn't feel able to take that strong a stand. But I will say this: if you feel safe and comfortable and respected in your job, your industry, your career, then you are in the perfect position to use up just some of that goodwill to stand and to push for the change that we so urgently need. Because design is crucial to what comes next. The future is going to need people like us, people who excel at behavior and system thinking and root causes. We get to help define the future. We help to arm people with the technologies, products, and the tools they'll need to flourish in those futures. Even to get a little bit melodramatic, we get to help the world survive the magnitude of change ahead. The reason I still love the technology industry, despite my somewhat middle-aged cynicism now, is that it holds an enormous amount of power. More than almost any other group, technologists get to depict and realize what happens next. Now, I'd say that power has been given us, it's not really warranted, we don't deserve it necessarily, it's been given us with too little oversight as well. But it suggests that we have what amounts to a moral obligation, I think, to turn that power toward positive change. We can offer this urgent shift in mindset, and we can offer the hope to help motivate that change. We can build the desire for change and the capacity for people to take that positive change. We build the tools to enable and to amplify those kind of desires. But we do have to do it very quickly. Bill McKibben, who's a climate activist, has this wonderful but rather horrifying quote as well, particularly when it comes to climate. Winning slowly is the same thing as losing. So the challenge before us is immense. I think we have a moral obligation to tackle it. We haven't got a moment to waste. So let's get started. Thank you.